this kind of lends itself to the situation of the last paper on the last panel of the end of a long, exhilarating day. So I'm kind of going to borrow another somewhat in the format of another somewhat German academic tradition, and share with you just 5 brief theses, which are provocations and speculations for further thinking. I'm still thinking through. I have these questions, the answers to which I'm working at. So I'm a little anxious, but I'm also excited, and I ask for your generosities. And thank you for sticking around. It's almost 5 o'clock. So I'd like to start by revisiting the opening presentations by Zachary and David, and to kind of reinvoke what they did in their presentations of kind of bringing forth experimental modes of sharing and presenting scholarly work, especially the interweaving of the personal and the professional. And it's really, empowering to share something like a process of thinking rather than a finished product of finished thought, which is, very much what I'm going to share. As I said, these are speculations, provocations, hypotheses for further elaboration, and it is the repair, I think, is already being deployed as a political and ethical concept. So this is also, in some sense, taking part in an ongoing conversation. So this is a response, but it's also that. Somewhat troubled. I'm somewhat troubled by the deployment of repair as as a kind of instrument, as a kind of solution. So my kind of observations are really speaking to that. A version of this will be published in an interdisciplinary collection around the idea of repair soon. So that's one thing. The second thing is the unique nature of this is by way of context, also by unique nature of the institution where I work, which is at RISD across the street, where the cross-hatching between the humanities, liberal arts humanities, and art and design happens in a very immediate and everyday way. So I have over the years grown to learn from and value certain things in the making disciplines. And it seemed like they could meet those of us who are working in the humanities halfway if only we are open to them. So this is the idea of repair, and the way I'm thinking this, is also part of a longer, larger project of which I'm at the very beginning of, is to explore if we can think the disciplines of design and humanities together. What's there, if it's even something. And the repair just happens to be let's say, kind of animating, even exemplary concept whose full potential, I would argue or suggest, in the contemporary moment can be realized through a co-articulation, a collaboration between these two disciplines. So can repair be a collaborative concept? Are there collaborative concepts? So those are, that's, just one kind of thing to start with. So I'll read, I'll read from here, and then occasionally kind of stop to, elaborate on a few things which might need elaboration. So there is a striking, so these are 5 theses, as I said, and I titled them that thesis on repair in most of the world. There is a striking refrain in Arzia, a Sufi-inspired qawwali from the critically acclaimed soundtrack of Rakesh Mehra's 2009 Hindi language film Delhi 6, that goes like this: Darare darare hai mathe pe maula, marammat muqaddar ki kar do maula. Beautifully shot in the backdrop of the majestic Jama Masjid in Old Delhi, this refrain is an alliterative entreaty to the divine master, in this case the Maula, and this can be translated in all kinds of ways, to repair one's destiny, literally the furrows on one's forehead, the place where it is believed one's fate is inscribed, conveyed by the use of the Hindi-Urdu word marammat, which comes by way of Persian and Arabic. But this unusual evocation of repair is not merely metaphorical. Street side stores that would do a marammat of anything from a damaged clock to a broken bicycle, and of course now the ubiquitous, the proverbial mobile phone, abound in the towns and cities of the South Asian subcontinent. Cognate words for the Latin root reparer do exist in South Asian languages and attest to the widespread nature of the practice in the sense of mending and restoring. Take the word rafu or rifu for darning, for instance. But if we want to engage with an idea and a practice on a truly equal, quote unquote, equal comparative scale, without repeating yet again the gesture of a Euro-US centrism, then, and since we are yet to kind of model a method of doing things philosophically with words in any language, I just want to connect this with what Emily Apter recently in her essay on just translation published in Public Culture says, and I quote Apter, just translation, which is kind of Apter's, this is a model of reparative translation that she's offering. Just translation aligns with the task of making philosophical terms accountable to political equality. But how does one do that? And I would say that this relates to the idea of opening up concepts, political concepts, ethical concepts to to invoke multilingual concepts, right? So I'm thinking of the Dictionary of Untranslatables, Barbara Casa's work, which was which was one major kind of gesture in this way, but it still was more or less focused on European languages. So Carol Gluck and Anna Singh's words in motion towards the global lexicon would be probably an example which tries to take this on. And I'm immediately thinking of Jean Ying's preceding presentation on the notion of the kind of working with the Chinese terms. So so to conclude the first thesis, repair is not just English, it is also much more than Latin. So the second thesis, repair is everywhere. Before the recent rise of repair cafes in Paris, right to repair movements in some high-income countries, notably in Europe, in the US, North America, and Australia, and a newfound fascination with repair at elite art and design schools, repair was a way of life in countries of the global South, as well as among the historically oppressed, historically marginalized minority communities in the North. It is so ubiquitous that in some sense it's unremarkable. But repair, like jugaad, is often born out of scarcity. This tends to get lost when we attempt to uncritically valorize these practices. Repair in most of the world is also often unlike much of the contemporary kind of DIY culture in the advanced capitalist countries, societies which gave us planned obsolescence and use and throw cultures in the first place, insofar as the latter presumes access to already existing tools and resources for fashioning a resistant selfhood and practice. The fact is that most repair, most of the time, takes place in settings where neither these features of advanced consumer culture nor conceptions of a right to repair have fully consolidated themselves, and violation of intellectual property rights go conveniently unnoticed. In scrambling the logics of capital and criminality, perhaps these small but widespread acts of repair approach the status of what Foucault, at a slightly different context, had described as a popular illegalism. And I'm thinking here of the work of the geographer Jason Lewis, who's worked on scammers, this practice of scammers in Jamaica, and fantastic work in ethnography where the argument is, the scammers, the call center operators who scam people for money, they perceive that as reparation for colonial harm. So it's a fascinating way to approach this. Modifying the words with which Raymond Williams had described culture many decades ago, could we say, yet again, repair is ordinary? It might be helpful to think of repair after translation, that other great instrument of remaking, as an act that exists within what Gayatri Spivak calls a double bind of being necessary yet impossible. The thinking together of reparation and translation, or rather reparative understanding of translation. I mentioned after at the beginning, but there's one can trace a genealogy here. Often come to the fore during large public acts of reconciliation. Mark Sanders' work on translation and reparation in the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, for instance, some of which also draws on all the way to Eve Sedgwick's idea of reparative reading, and then Spivak has their own reading of this, but that's not that's not entirely the way I'm kind of connecting this conversation with translation. I would offer, I find productive what Fred Morton says in Black and Blur, talking about repair. And I'm just going to read the quote. This is Morton. What if we could detach repair not only from restoration, but also from the very idea of the original? This is where I'm thinking, seeing the parallel with translation. What if we could detach repair not only from restoration, but also from the very idea of the original? Not so that repair comes first, but that it comes before. Then making and repair are inseparable, devoted to one another, suspended between and beside themselves. So, I'll just come back to the Morton quote in a bit, building on this in the second, in the next point. Talking about public acts of reconciliation, in the spirit of, as I said, Mark Sanders' work on Truth and Reconciliation in the United States, there is a revitalized Poor People's Campaign, among others, that are talking of a third reconstruction in the spirit of Du Bois, to achieve the unfulfilled promises of the first 2 moments of Black Reconstruction. Since translation can also enable violation, Apter has again recently reminded us about the possibilities of just translation as an attempt to test, quote unquote, the hypothesis that language and the critical faculty of translation, which trains the ear to hear injustice, has a role to play in the politics of reparations. In order to think justice, it is imperative to think reparation. This is also building on Apter. But repair, like translation, is always not enough. The next thesis. Repair is not necessarily improvement. Understood, could repair be understood as maintenance? Could it be a signal of, as well as a response to, a condition that Jasbir Puar has theorized as debility? Another, neither capacity nor disability, but a slow, unremitting decline. This is, since writing this, I've kind of been thinking about this. I need to think a little more about how, if at all, debility works, but this is, but here it is. The incidence of repair is often thought to be a symptom of a failure, a breakdown, a crisis, but when used as a measure of quick fix, a response to discontent, repair can end up restoring the status quo. Speaking from within design pedagogy, and this is where it harks back to the point, to the Morton observation. Speaking from within design pedagogy, Alexander Crosby and J.C. Adam Stein have recently offered a compelling take on this, neither progressive nor conservative character of repair. In place of this dominant notion of repair as fixing, they argue for thinking about the interlocked trajectories of repair as design and designing as repair. But in the volume that brings together some of the deliberations of the study gathering that accompanied Anker Centrum, Surviving in the Ruinous Ruin, Natasha Hagigian's contribution to the German Pavilion in the 58th Venice Biennale, the artist remarks, and I quote, "One thing that fascists seem to do is promise, fascism seems to do is promise that it can repair things. Repair, like translation again, can be disquietingly double-edged. The last point. Repair must always take place in view of that which cannot be repaired. In his attempt to reorient our thinking about New World slavery in the direction of a moral and reparatory history, anthropologist David Scott draws our attention to the politics of reparation that attends upon historical evils that, quote, remains unrepaired in the present, whose wrongs continue to disfigure generations, and which in consequence call out now for a just response. I'm also, I think the reference to critical fabulation came up in an earlier presentation, I think Lynn's presentation, and I'm thinking again, how Hartman, Saidi Hartman mobilizes that to think about the notion of repairing the archive, right? The non-existent archive, the imperfect archive. So yet another, kind of direction where this goes. While I have increasingly found the notion of the endlessly translatable more productive, I do think that the concept of the untranslatable as a limit, but also as a horizon, is still helpful in situations where we could think outside the discipline of literary studies or comparative literature, where we could think with disciplines like design. So the irreparable haunts all politics of reparations. Perhaps before we could begin to imagine new emancipatory futures, we need to honor what Scott calls, quote unquote, the permanent racial debt, even as we acknowledge that it can never be fully repaid. Perhaps even as we urge for reparations for generational wrongs and injustice, we should begin to learn how to live and think and feel through the brokenness, because there are things beyond repair. Now, I have a few more, kind of sub points to go through, and I know this is, my presentation is, probably on the shorter side, but I would, as I said, these are meant for, very condensed points, meant for, further thoughts and feedback and response. So I would stop here, if that's okay, with you, Adi, Sharon, and Tim, and just, okay. Use the, hopefully things that will come up in comments to talk a little more.